Welcome back to Coast. Jim Marrs is an award-winning journalist. He has over 30 years of experience with Texas newspapers. He was an Army intelligence officer during the Vietnam era, an aerospace writer. He's written several best-selling books, including the one that sort of put him on the map, a book called Crossfire that was part of the inspiration for the Oliver Stone movie JFK. Jim Marrs, always great to have you on the show.
Hey, George, it's always a pleasure to be with you. And
I want to get to the JFK stuff in a moment, but it's sort of the starting point for you. I was amazed in reading your bio that you had to submit Crossfire to 25 publishers before one would put it out, even though everyone said, man, it was a great book. It's factual. It's well-researched and documented. 25 publishers passed on it. I guess looking back, you're not surprised now with the broader framework that you have that so many wouldn't even touch it. You know, what we're going to use for tonight's discussion is your most recent book. It's called Our Occulted History, Do the Global Elite Conceal Ancient Aliens? And we'll get into specifics in a moment. But in general, for you, you went down a rabbit hole 30 years ago or so when you wrote Crossfire. That was pretty wild for you to challenge the conventional view of the JFK assassination. But it's nothing compared to where you've gone now. I mean, you had no idea where this would lead, the threads of that conspiracy that led to something so much bigger and more sinister.
Well, George, it's interesting that you're talking to me about that because from what I know, you've gone down that same rabbit hole.
That's right. But from a different thread, you know, from
right.
a different thread. It ends up at the same place, though, doesn't it?
Well, when you start if you don't start off with a preconceived idea like the government has in most of its investigations, and you start following the evidence, then you end up at the same place. But, you know, this might interest you because I'm holding in my hand here a very yellowed copy of my old newspaper I used to work for, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, which is a major metropolitan newspaper. And the top headline on the front page says, panel may face possibility of coup in JFK's slaying. And the first lead says, the new House Committee on Assassinations may find itself faced with the distinct possibility that a coup d'etat occurred in 1963 with the complicity of U.S. government officials. And a little later down in there, and this is interesting too, because a lot of people think that it's only recently that we've decided that there's something other than a lone assassin. But it says even before 1970, national polls reported as many as 80% of the public disbelieved the Warren Commission's conclusion that Oswald acted, not acted alone. Now, George, this story was written and published in the Star-Telegram on December the 1st, 1976. Okay? So this is nothing new, folks. The information has been there all along. It simply has not been presented to the public in a comprehensive and repetitive way.
In your book, you mentioned about JFK, and, you know, in several books you've mentioned about the conspiracy, and we'll get into some specifics in a moment. But in the larger picture, in this Our Occulted History, you mentioned about how some of this stuff has been reported. You've reported it. Others have reported it.
Right.
And it seems to get us nowhere. I mean, is it disconcerting and disappointing to you on some level that it can't seem to quite break through?
Well, I've been at this for about almost 50 years now, so I've kind of gotten inured a little bit to it. I realize that most people are they have their hands full trying to take care of their life and their family and their job, and this is why my big complaint is with the so-called news media. This is where the public turns because when they want to know what's going on. They're too busy with their lives. They can't, so they turn on the TV, they turn on the radio, they pick up their newspaper because they want to find out what's going on, and they're not being told.
You don't feel hopeless, do you?
No, not at all. In fact, I feel vindicated. Here we are 51 years after the Kennedy assassination, and I've been trying to tell people all along there was a conspiracy, and today the vast majority of people, according to national polls, do understand and accept that there was a conspiracy. What you have, though, is this dichotomy of the masses of the public understanding that there was something going on, but the opinion leaders, the politicians, and the federal government, and the mass corporate media, they're trying to tell us something completely different. This is nothing new. We can go back and start talking all the way back to Pearl Harbor, which most everybody today is taught in school and still believes was this surprise attack by the Japanese on our base in Hawaii. But what is now understood by serious historians is that certain people in the United States, high in the government, and yes, we're talking about Franklin Roosevelt and his chief of staff, General George Marshall, they knew Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked, and they allowed it to happen because it satisfied their political goal of getting an aroused, angered, and united American public into the war.
Well, we'll start earlier and work our way up to that. This book, I was wondering when I saw the title, it's been out for about a year now, but Our Occulted History, I was wondering to myself, where is Jim Marrs going with this? Witchcraft, sorcery, or what? But you point out early on that the word occult isn't really something about the supernatural at all.
No, it's not. I use the term in the astronomical sense. When the moon eclipses the sun, that's called an occultation. It occults the sun. It hides or masks the sun. And so basically this is about hidden history, about history that goes all the way back, and it's pretty astounding. And George, again, this is great that you and I, because you've been wrestling with the extraterrestrial situation for a good number of years now, and I think probably you would agree with me that it's really astounding when you go back and look through history to find that the whole history of humankind is just rife with stories of beings that fly through the air, that come from other worlds, that have brought us knowledge, that have brought us technology, brought us farming, law, language. It's just there if you want to look at it.
And in a bad way, too. You start off the book with references to two things that I'm familiar with. Charles Fort, who wrote in this thing called the Book of the Damned, a statement that we've heard before, that he thought, after studying all kinds of paranormal weird stuff, that we are, quote, property of some other intelligence. And then you also make a reference to a guy, William Bramley, who wrote a book in 1990 called The Gods of Eden, came out of nowhere, but he had covered some of the same territory, and then he left. He left the scene and didn't write about it anymore, suggesting that there is an inherent relationship between war in human history and strife and death and some kind of other intelligence. So why don't we start it there? I mean, you picked up, you cast a pretty wide net in suggesting that there has been interaction with some other intelligence for a very long time.
Well, that's true. And the thing is, if this is nothing new. What I do in my book, Our Occulted History, and go back and show that there is compelling evidence, sometimes almost overwhelming, that this planet and perhaps our entire solar system has been visited in the far distant past by non-human intelligences. One of the key tip-offs of all this is the fact that we're well aware of the mystery of the pyramids in Egypt. The Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, for example, show very definite evidence of heavy water erosion, which means they sat out under rains for a long time, and heavy rains. And yet the geologists will tell you that there has not been significant rainfall on the Giza Plateau for more than 10,000 years, which means the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, at least, were probably in existence thousands of years before the Egyptians ever came along. Well, then who built them? And then you begin to broaden your view, and you find out that it's not just Egypt that has pyramids. We've got pyramids in South America and in Central America and in the Mississippi River Valley and in China and in Bosnia and under the Caribbean and in Russia. Holy cow, there's pyramids everywhere. And then we find out there's pyramids on the moon. And there's pyramids that are in startlingly similar configuration to those on the Giza Plateau on the planet Mars. So wait a minute, what's going on here? Has there been a super technological civilization that had interplanetary flight long before our recorded history? And this seems to be the case, particularly when you start throwing in all of the ancient legends and stories, such as the ancient civilizations of Mu or Atlantis, is just there. It's just there. Not to mention all of the anomalies and artifacts that we find all around the world. I love that term, anomalies. That's the WTF of the science world. You know, what is it? We don't know. So we'll call it an anomaly.
Well, I said when we started that you cast a very wide net, and it's even bigger than that. You start talking about the origins of the solar system, the origins of the moon, and there's some stuff in there I don't think I've ever read before. I don't remember seeing before that the moon is a billion years older than the Earth, which casts doubt, all kinds of doubt, on what we've always heard about how the moon formed.
That's true. And in fact, I'd ask everyone to just stop and consider this. See, when I was a kid in school, we were told that the moon broke away from the Earth.
Right.
But now that we've been there, we know that the composition of moon rocks is not in any way similar to the composition of rocks on Earth. And as you said, some of the rocks found on the moon predate the Earth. So it came from somewhere else. So picture the Earth hanging in space. Here comes the moon from somewhere, and it's sailing along. It goes past the Earth, gets caught in the Earth's gravitational field, and it's pulled back. And that goes on for, thousands of years until it finally gets into orbit around the Earth. Well, then, okay, but it should be in an elongated elliptical orbit, probably wobbling around, especially since we know that the center of gravity in the moon is not in the center. It's about 2 miles off center. Now, if you take a ball and the inner core is off center and you try to roll it along the floor, it's just going to wobble all around.
I'll tell you what, Jim, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're going to have to take a break. When we come back, I want to continue the conversation about the moon, because there's something you tell us in the book about the time that it reverberated like a bell when something smashed into it. You got to hear this story. Jim Marrs, author of Our Occulted History, is my guest. Fine Young Cannibals take us into the break. That's a promising cowpunk band, Lone Justice. The song is Ways to Be Wicked from 1985, co-written by Tom Petty and Mike Campbell. Pretty good tune. Sadly, that band no longer exists. We're talking with the one and only Jim Marrs, whose new book, Our Occulted History, casts a very wide net, looking at the global elite, ancient aliens, conspiracies. A lot more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. Before the break, we're talking with Jim Marrs about his new book, our latest book, Our Occulted History, and some anomalies regarding the moon, how the moon is a billion years older than Earth, which is very troublesome if you, like I, heard in school growing up that the moon formed from a chunk of the Earth. But there are other facts in the book that I found equally disturbing, and one of them deals with a lunar module that slammed into the moon. And Jim, I don't recall ever reading this before about what happened as a result of that.
Well, it was in the mainstream media. It's one of the landers, the booster. They let it go, and it dropped back onto the moon. And according to NASA officials, the moon rang and reverberated like a bell for like 6 or 7 hours, which, would tend to indicate that it was a hollow object. But, of course, as science tells us, a natural object cannot be a hollow object. So it's interesting because at one point I had occasion to interview Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon. And I asked him, I said, what do you think about the theory that the moon is hollow? And he kind of laughed and said, oh, no, the moon's not hollow. But then he went on to say, of course, we do speculate because we know that the heavier materials are on the outside, that there may be giant caverns in the moon. Well, here's a famous hero astronaut. I don't want to get in his face, but I'm thinking, hey, giant caverns in the moon, hollow moon, what's the difference? But the other key thing that I was getting to was if the moon came along and was captured, by the Earth, then it should be in a wobbly, erratic, elliptical orbit and kind of wobbling around the Earth. But that's not the case. The moon is in a perfect near circular orbit right around the equator and stationary, with one side always facing the Earth. And even the famous scientist Isaac Asimov said the moon shouldn't be where it is. But, George, this leads us to the great dichotomy of our thinking, you see, because we know the moon's been there as long as human written history is there, because people have all written and talked about the moon. And we also know there's no such things as aliens. And yet it seems that it's been parked there. It was parked in this particular and peculiar orbit, particularly since it's at the exact distance away from the Earth that when it eclipses the sun, it just totally covers the corona of the sun. It's just at that perfect distance and stationary and in a near perfect circular orbit. So it had to, the only explanation for being where it is it was parked there. But we know there's no aliens, and we know we didn't do it. So let's just not talk about it. We won't talk about that.
You know, the Coast to Coast has these shows on from time to time about anomalies on the moon and on Mars. And I sort of just agreed that I'm going to put that aside because it's too much for me. I've seen some of the photos, and I think people tell me, oh, yeah, there's a skyscraper. And I look at the photos, and I think, well, it looks like a dirt clod to me. But you mentioned a couple of examples in this book that I was unfamiliar with about structures on the moon that sure as heck sound like they were made by somebody.
That's right. Well, there's one particular point that juts off the surface of the moon for almost a mile up that's called the Shard, and it's in NASA photographs, and yet nobody has any explanation for what it is. I've also seen, now, I'm kind of with you, George. I've seen so many, there's a lot of stuff out on the internet that says, oh, look, here's a Coke bottle on the moon. Oh, yeah. Look, here's a human skull. Here's Bigfoot on Mars or whatever. So there's a lot of junk out there. And most of it's kind of blurry little something. And it's kind of like, counting elephants in the clouds or something. But there are others that are really, truly amazing. Some NASA photographs that show tracks on the moon. One particular I'm thinking of that shows what looks like tank treads almost coming down off the side of a crater and moving out onto the flat plain with some kind of round object there, And, of course, my first thought was that, well, this, is a round type rock, and it somehow came loose, and it rolled down the side of the crater, rolled out on the plain. And yet in the original photograph, you can actually see that these tracks come up the inside of the crater. And, of course, we all know nothing rolls up. That's just a natural object. So, and then you add to that the fact that lights have been seen moving on the moon. There was a water spray that swept across the moon. And structures. In the 50s, it was reported that they saw a bridge-type artifact traversing one of the craters, and this was seen by other astronomers for weeks, and then all of a sudden it wasn't there anymore. Something is going on.
As part of casting your wide net, not only what we know about the solar system and the formation of the moon and things like that are wrong, but you suggest that what we know about humanity itself is wrong, that evolution, there are some pretty serious problems with the theory of evolution. And before all the intelligent design people start whooping and hollering, you got to be careful what you wish for, because the intelligent designer may not be God,
or not the God as we picture.
Yeah. You make the point, though, that, you start with a discussion about the Smithsonian, the idea that could our understanding of human history and earlier civilizations be totally distorted? Could you conceal something like that? And the Smithsonian, if they haven't, they sure have made a good attempt at it.
That's exactly right. And I point that out in my book. Man, what most people don't understand about the Smithsonian is that, yes, we do view that as this premier scientific artifact, or institution, which is true. But what a lot of people don't understand is that the Smithsonian Institute is a branch of the federal government. It's owned by the government. And so, therefore, unfortunately, so many artifacts, anomalies, strange things have disappeared into the Smithsonian, never to be heard of again. One example is a newspaper article from 1909 that goes into great detail about how that they found these caves in the north end of the Grand Canyon with Egyptian artifacts in them. And it gives a very detailed description, and it says all of this was turned over to the Smithsonian. But the Smithsonian today disclaims any of this, says, no, that never happened. And yet, what puzzles me is that, sure enough, on the north side of the Grand Canyon, especially around the area around 94 Mile Creek and Trinity Creek, we find formations in areas that have been named the Tower of Set and the Tower of Ra and the Horus Temple, and the Temple of Isis and Osiris. Well, where did those names come from if there wasn't some tie and connection to the Egyptians?
Explain you have another example that's more recent, that's from 1999. National Park Service in Arizona, in this canyon, there's a big washout, torrential rains that uncover a bunch of really strange skeletons. And Park Service employees all go out there. They're pressed into service to gather them up, put them in boxes, and they go to the Smithsonian, and it's overseen by the FBI. Now, what's the deal on that?
What is the deal on that? And you go try to ask them about it, and they say, oh, that never happened. This is what I'm talking about in our hidden history, our occulted history. But now, if you really want to get weird about it, I would like to tell you about sidereal time.
Okay.
What is sidereal time? Well, we use the common meridian time, which is based on the rotation of the Earth around the sun. And we gauge that in 24-hour segments, and this is what we use. It also causes problems because, like, you're in Las Vegas, and so, you're in a different time zone than I am. It causes us some problems. So sidereal time is used by astronomers and astrophysicists, NASA, as well as the ancient seamen, and this is gauging time by the movement of the stars. And, of course, the stars do move, but ever so slowly to our perception. So this is called sidereal time. And sidereal time is also broken into 24-hour sections. Okay, fine. So you're with me with that. So what's the big deal? Okay, the big deal is that, let's go back to the Kennedys. You got Joseph Kennedy Jr., who was killed in a mysterious plane explosion piloting a super secret craft in World War II, and he died in 1944. John F. Kennedy, of course, was killed in November 1963 in Dallas. What is largely not understood was that Ted Kennedy almost lost his life in a plane crash in mid-1964. Robert Kennedy, of course, was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in 1968, and John F. Kennedy Jr. died in a plane crash in 1999, just as he had let some people know that he was going to run for senator of New York. Okay, well, you would think that that's just terrible, and in fact it's been termed the Kennedy curse, but what nobody understands and what to me strikes me as being so weird is that all of those Kennedy brothers' deaths occurred within the same sidereal hour, the 16th hour. It's pretty amazing. That would be like saying that they all died between noon and 1 o'clock on the same day. Now, that to have a series of these 6 events happening all in the same hour that has been computed to be 191 million times, not possible. It would be the same as rolling 24-sided dice 6 times in a row and having a consistent outcome of the number 16. It's really just amazing. So what this tells us is that, in fact, the National Optical Astronomy Observatory said that all these evidence fall within the same hour of the local sidereal time. Now, that's really not possible unless this was all part of some weird cosmic plan. And to add to that mystery and to add to that seemingly occult situation is, it's true that the important space missions by NASA, particularly the Apollo missions, the date and time of the launches, it turns out, were not established by any scientific criteria, but by astrological alignment of the planets. Now, whether you want to believe in that or not is not material. But the point is that somebody with enough power to set the date and time of Apollo space shots did believe in this occultism.
Wow.
Yeah,
I want to come back to the Kennedy curse because but before we leave the bigger picture of who is responsible for this, because I'll tell you, frankly, if there's a global elite, I would think the Kennedys would be part of it. But we'll come back to that. Before we leave the bigger picture, you write extensively about ancient civilizations, in particular the Sumerians, who gave us so much of what we consider to be the bedrocks of civilization. They and other ancient civilizations, pretty much all of them, wrote the same kind of accounts of these interactions with gods from the sky, ancient beings, traveling in spaceships. All of those civilizations had the same basic story, and we discount all of it as sort of quaint, provincial, dumb, not accurate.
Well, that's because when these ancient civilizations were first beginning to be studied in a scientific manner, that takes us back into the early to mid 1800s. Those people, even the most scientific of them at that time, had no inkling of atoms. They didn't even know about penicillin. They didn't know about germs. And they certainly didn't know about spacecraft. They didn't even think it was possible for heavier than air flight. And so when they read these accounts of these ancient people, from the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the ancient Chinese, all accounts through history about beings who came down from the sky, were able to fly through the air, and gave us knowledge, then they just wrote that off as mythology. Oh, well, these were their gods. This is who they worship. What's really fascinating and revealing is when you go back and actually study the stories themselves, many of those ancient peoples and civilization did not refer to them as gods. They just referred to them as individuals. For example, the ancient Sumerian tablets that are still in existence, because unlike paper and papyrus that can burn up and be destroyed or deteriorate, these were etched in stone or in mud and then baked into stone, and they still exist. And they simply said the Anunnaki, and that's been translated as those who came from the heavens and landed on the earth. And so it was only later interpretation, not translation, that suddenly transformed these beings into ancient gods. For example, if you want to read the story of the Anunnaki, it's all in the Encyclopedia Britannica. But you have to look under Sumerian mythology, because that's where they've placed them, and that's where most people have relegated these stories. But once you begin to take a different interpretation, not translation, just the interpretation, and you go, wait a minute, maybe they're telling us about real beings and about real people or real entities, okay? And this is what I try to tell people, is that when you have the opportunity, you need to start considering that some of these stories may actually be true. I mean, this may be what they're trying to tell us.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, for example, when you look at the so-called mythology, and you begin to see that although the names change due to language is changing, you find the same individuals and the same personalities. For example, the Sumerians said there was one Anunnaki who was in the sky, the patriarch of these Anunnaki, and his name was Anu. Well, in the Egyptian mythology, we find it's Amun-Ra. In the Greek, it's Kronos, and in the Roman, it's Saturn. And then there was the Lord over the earth, which in the Sumerian was Enlil, in the Egyptian is Set, the Greek is Zeus, Roman is Jupiter. Same thing with the goddess of love. In the Sumerian was Astaroth, in Egyptian Hathor, in Greek Aphrodite, and in Roman Venus. And we keep thinking of these as totally separate civilizations, and yet what we find is that they can all be traced back, and they all are a de-evolution of the Sumerian civilization that devolved into the Babylonian, the Syrian, and then into the Egyptian, and then into the Greek, and then the Roman. And so we find that perhaps they're actually talking about the same entities, the same intelligent beings. It's just that the names change as the language is changed.
I thought one of the most persuasive and interesting parts of the book are about anthropologists, modern anthropology, sociologists, the folks who presumably would want to figure out this stuff, and how willing they are to suppress anything that goes against the grain. I mean, you got some pretty good examples.
Yeah, that's very true. But, never underestimate the power of the status quo. When you have someone who has built a reputation and published some books and maybe has a tenured professorship, all based on Egyptology, then they are loath to admit that maybe they were totally wrong about it all.